think you can go ahead.
Okay, sure, great. Thank you, Yang, for the introduction, and it's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen here, so can everybody see my screen just fine, and my sound is good?
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you again, and Max also for inviting me to kick off this workshop, which is very exciting. I wanted to talk a little bit about what is 4D material science to start off, and maybe just give you a few examples of how we can use this 4D material science approach to solve cutting-edge research problems, and then maybe go into a little bit on the actual NSF AI Institute planning grant, which we had put together while I was at ASU. And now during that time, once we got it awarded, that was when I was making the move to Purdue. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the goals and teams and participants, and Yang has been a real driving force in that regard. And finally, just talk a little bit about application of AI to some of the imaging challenges, and hopefully that will spur some discussion in the later roundtables that we have planned. So when we talk about 4D material science, really we think about highly complex microstructures, and we're looking at microstructures in 3 dimensions. And people always ask me, well, what is the 4th dimension? The 4th dimension here is really time. And so if we add the 3-dimensional microstructural aspects, and then we add the time resolved part of this, and it could be a material, a microstructure that is under any kind of external stimulus. It could be a mechanical stimulus, a thermal, electrical stimulus. We're really looking at how that microstructure is evolving, how it's changing dynamically, how it's morphing over time. And using these tools, which I have here on the bottom, it can range from a variety of different length scales, all the way from X-rays at the sort of submicron length scales, X-rays at the nanoscale. You can look at even things like focus ion beam tomography, although it is destructive, so a little bit difficult to do the 4D part there. But there are a range of length scales and a range of techniques that go along with those length scales. And I like to tell my students that, you know, we are in a time now where we have amazing tools and amazing capabilities to solve problems that have been confounding us for decades and almost centuries. And I'll hopefully give you some examples of how the 4D approach, the whole 4D techniques and understanding, there's a lot of things that go in with data science, and in addition to the imaging, which are important, and AI and machine learning are becoming important tools to handle that data accurately and efficiently. And hopefully I'll give you some examples of that. So at ASU, we had the Center for 4D Material Science, which has essentially been transferred over to Purdue. And of course, we have a lot of good people still working at ASU in some of these areas. And so there are 3 main thrusts to the center. One is in situ kind of experiments. So doing real-time deformation experiments, for example. This is a foam that was compressed, and we looked at the deformation of that foam in real time. Then we have the multi-scale microscopy aspect of this. And really, I would say it's almost a correlative, it is a correlative approach to looking at microstructures at a variety of different length scales. And the idea really is that one technique cannot really give us all of the answers to a particular problem. So we need to couple different techniques. We have to couple different length scales. And this is where the data fusion theme of the Institute really came about, in terms of fusing multimodal and very different kinds of data into one sort of big complex solution. And finally, the thrust also on 3D imaging and crystallography. And here I want to highlight a new experimental capability that we have in the lab, which is to get three-dimensional crystallographic orientation in addition to simple absorption or phase contrast-based imaging. And this is relatively recent. It's something that has been done at the synchrotron for many years, but now we have this capability to do diffraction contrast tomography, DCT, to get non-destructive grain orientation information. That can be a powerful tool in solving a variety of different problems too. So a little bit about our facilities. We have X-ray microscopy capabilities for imaging and crystallography. We can correlate this with mechanical property measurements at the nanoscale using nano indentation, and this can go all the way from -120 C to 800 C, and you can do experiments with the liquid cell. And I show these as maybe just, again, to spur some discussion amongst our workshop participants to think about creative ways where we can use these facilities to solve some of these intricate problems. So these are some of the research thrusts that we have in our group here. We recently started looking into sort of bio-inspired materials, and I'm going to move the Zoom panel here. So we have an example of a Venus flower basket, which is a deep sea silica-based creature, fibrous kind of creature. It's actually quite interesting. We're learning a lot of things from this basket and taking some of those natural design principles into additive manufacturing and making synthetic-based materials. I'll show you some recent work on honeycombs and how bees actually make these combs and why they make these combs. It's really fascinating how colonies of bees actually go about doing their work and making these cellular structures. And then more on sort of the more traditional metallic materials. We have work going on corrosion in lightweight additive manufactured materials, and also looking at some cellular-based materials. These are more polymers. And this is a collaboration with Adidas, the shoemaker, actually looking at how to characterize and how to develop better cellular materials for high-performance footwear. So let me tell you a little bit about the work on the honeybees, and I'm really quite excited about this because it's quite new and quite different, but I think it illustrates the 4D approach very nicely. So my student Rahul Franklin here, he's actually taken a colony of these bees with a queen bee, and we work with the Purdue Bee Lab, and we actually take the honeycomb that's being built and scan it at different times. So this is actually an interrupted ex situ experiment. And so we're looking at this hexagonal hierarchical structure, and over the evolution of time, we can actually start to see how the bees actually construct these cells. And one of the things that we've been able to demonstrate is that the conventional wisdom on how the bees make these cells is that they start with a cylinder, and then once they have that cylinder, they mold that cylinder into a hexagonal shape. And actually from these 4D types of experiments, we've shown that that's really not the case, that the bees actually make wall by wall by wall, and they start with a very rough, very almost primitive kind of structure, and they use their mandibles to actually mash the wax, and you can see the porosity inside of that honeycomb structure actually gets smaller and smaller over time because they're densifying the wax as they make the hexagonal structure. So I won't have time to go through all of the details here, but there are some very interesting engineering design principles at play, and you can actually exploit these to make new materials. So here I show you, for example, this is the cell wall. So think of a cross section of a cell wall, and there is this bulb-shaped wax gob, for lack of a better term, which we call the coping. And it appears that the bees are actually compacting the wax over time and pushing this coping out to the edge of the comb. And there's always been this question about what is the role of the coping for the bees. And one of the things that we have noticed is that the coping actually keeps the honey from flowing out of the cell during the comb making process. And you can see some examples of this. And with the 4D tomography, you can actually visualize this non-destructively. We have actually measured angles of some of these cells. And you can see that when you have the honey, of course, there's almost like a simple beam and you're getting some deformation there. But the fact that the coping is actually situated in such a way, it keeps the honey from flowing out, and you have contributions from surface tension and surface roughness that are keeping this honey in place. So, and here again, I think is conclusive proof that the bees do not make cylinders that transition into hexagonal cells. You can see here a cell that actually has 5 walls to it, and the bees are now constructing the 6th wall. So you can see that the construction process takes place wall by wall by wall. And so the cylindrical hypothesis appears to be disproved by our 4D data here. Okay, I'll just give you a couple of more examples. Here's an example in the additive area related to carbon fiber composites. And here we were looking at damage related to a laser assisted zone. So you actually have some evaporation of the polymer here, and just some of the carbon fibers are sticking out. And using a lot of the reconstruction and image segmentation tools, we were able to develop a mechanistic understanding of how damage initiates and how damage progresses. So here you can see delamination between the 0 and 90-degree fibers, and you see cracking of the fibers in the 0-degree plies, and then eventually that essentially converges into individual fiber fracture and failure of the composite. So you can actually, using the 4D approach, you can get a very nice story of the damage progression in these materials. Okay. So now imaging is a great tool, and we can image a variety of different microstructural features. But as I mentioned, one of the really exciting frontiers, I think, in the 4D area is looking at crystallographic orientation and using this in a multimodal approach with the imaging data to again understand mechanisms of deformation or other kinds of time-resolved mechanisms. So with diffraction contrast tomography, you can map the crystalline structure and get 3D grain orientation. And so you can think of applying this technique to microstructural evolution studies that involve things like grain growth or crack propagation. And really, I think the exciting part here is the multimodal aspect of this in terms of combining the different streams of data. Okay, so how does it work? So essentially, you have your X-ray source here. It goes through an aperture or potentially a filter. You have your sample that is sitting here and is actually being rotated. So if you're familiar with Lowy diffraction, essentially we're doing this in 3D. So you get it's a Lowy focusing geometry. You have a beam stop here, and in conventional Lowy you would have individual spots. But because we are rotating the sample, those spots actually now start to become streaks. And so you can then start to be able to index, and this is actually a big data intensive problem, is indexing those streaks, correlating them to the grain orientation, and then mapping out the grain boundaries for those particular grains in 3D. So here's an example of some work we're doing with Javier Yorca at IMDEA in Spain, in Madrid. and they're interested in understanding slip transfer in cubic and hexagonal materials. So on the bottom is actually a Schmidt factor color plot of sort of the loading direction based on the loading direction. So so red means actually very close to 0.4 or 0.5 Schmidt factor, so more prone to slip. And in 3 dimensions, what we're doing is getting the grain orientation, and in this particular case, it's in titanium. And we can get the grain orientation information a priori, and then we can apply a tensile stress and then study where the slip is taking place and how transfer takes place. What kinds of boundaries are more prone to slip transfer, and how does slip initiate and how does it propagate over time? So using DCT. Okay. And finally, another example here is related to corrosion. This is something that we have worked with Yang and his group in understanding what kinds of boundaries are more prone to corrosion. And there seems to be a sweet spot here in terms of misorientation angle, where we see most of the corroded grain boundaries. And we're still trying to understand how grain orientation relates to precipitate density, morphology, and why are we getting this particular peak here in grain boundary misorientation in terms of the susceptibility to corrosion. Right. And finally, I'll just show you some work that we've done at the synchrotron. This is some work at the Argonne National Lab. This is using synchrotron radiation. So we're looking at much higher flux and parallel beam geometry. The resolution is still around 1 micron or so, and or in some cases a little bit less than a micron. And here I'll show you an example related to the footwear. So this is the work with Adidas. So if there are any runners out there and you use Adidas shoes, you're probably running using the Ultra Boost. Could be a Boost, Ultra Boost 2. But essentially, it's made up of beads, which are foamed. And each of these beads is essentially a cellular material. And those beads are then compacted together using steam chest molding to get this kind of a overall beaded structure. And you can see the interfaces there are nicely bonded between the individual beads. And what's interesting about these particular beads is that they have a graded porous structure. So the beads in the interior of the cell are much larger than the ones close to the surface of the beads. And so there is a gradient there. And so we use the 4D approach here to essentially do in situ experiments on individual beads. So here is a bead at cross-section of a bead at 0% strain. And after 50% strain, you can see the collapse of the cell walls and the overall deformation. And most of this is taking place at the outside of the bead. And what's interesting is that the interior of the bead is actually quite stable and does not undergo a lot of deformation. So most of this is actually localized and gives you a lot of that nice response when you're walking or running with these shoes. So so with the 3D data, we were able to actually take measurements of volumetric strain. And so you can start to get experimental measurements of the Poisson ratio of these materials. And depending upon the bead, it's somewhere between 0.3 to 0.35, and some other beads are closer to 0.25. So
a quick question, Nick. Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So are there like a porosity here? I mean, what exactly is shown here? I mean, I don't quite understand. I mean, you see this little, yeah.
Yeah, so the you can see my pointer here.
Yeah.
These are all the pores. These are all the hollow cells.
Okay.
And the lighter gray is the polymer, and they're essentially the ligaments.
I see.
So you cannot see so much on the outside because the pores are a lot smaller.
I see.
Getting close to the resolution of the technique. But one of the interesting things is because of the residual stresses, once the blowing process is done, some of those ligaments are actually somewhat bent, and they're actually close to buckling. So I don't know if you can see that here. So some of the, and so those are actually prone to local buckling when we do the decompression experiments.
Another question. This is under S3, right? Will the S3 kind of damage the structure at all? I mean, this is a polymer.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we did some experiments to look at that, and so in many of the beads, we expose them to the X-rays, and then we take the beads out and we do some hysteretic stress strain measurements, and in most cases they retain their elasticity and their stress strain behavior. There was one trip that we made where the shutter, the X-ray shutter, was on throughout the 4D experiment. And there you could see that the beads were significantly damaged. They became discolored and became extremely brittle. You could break it with your fingers. So it's something you need to be concerned about. But if they're very short bursts of X-rays, and the experiments are relatively short, on the order of a few seconds, then you can minimize that X-ray damage.
I see. Thanks.
Yeah. But that's a great point, and especially with polymers, it's something that one needs to be concerned about. So I'll just show you one more thing here. This is with the transmission X-ray microscopy, also at the APS. Here we can get down to 20 nanometer resolution. And I want to show you an example of multimodal correlative kind of approach here. So we were able to do tomography in a corrosive environment. So you can see stress corrosion cracking here. And then when we came back to the lab, we were able to then do serial sectioning with the fib and get grain orientation. And so we're essentially looking at the interplay between grain boundary precipitate size, grain boundary misorientation, and the susceptibility to corrosion. So the blue here are nanoscale precipitates. The yellow are actually larger intermetallic inclusions, red and green. And what's superimposed on top of that is the serial sectioning grain orientation information. So we could actually then conclusively say that the crack is propagating in the region of highest grain boundary misorientation. So you really need all aspects of this data to come to that conclusion. All right. So how did we get to the AI sort of planning grant? And again, a lot of credit to Yang and Max and Ankit and Holong and the rest of the team as we sort of put this vision together. We took a lot of these challenges in 4D material science that come about with the imaging and reconstruction and the image segmentation, and came up with three main areas: AI-assisted automated sort of multimodal data acquisition, and how to handle a lot of the images and reconstruction that come with that. I'll show you some challenges that we're running into. A lot of the work that Yang and his group are doing with respect to material representation and using 2- and 3-point correlation functions, along with Max, to actually develop algorithms to fingerprint these materials. And the third thrust, which I think is really the most ambitious, is to build some physics-based kind of learning for predicting a lot of the modeling and design that we're observing in the experiments. And so hopefully we'll be able to accomplish that. So I think I'm actually missing one slide here, and that was with the participants. I don't know why it skipped through that one. So again, this is actually the team. Once I left, Yang is the PI of the project, and I look at these 4 guys, and I hired 3 of them while I was at ASU. So I'm actually very proud of this team and everything they've accomplished. Yang, Ankit, Holong were all through searches that I chaired while I was at ASU, and Max is also a very important part of this team. Other external collaborators from Kentucky, Syracuse, Nevada, and Pejman at Wyoming. And so again, these are the main three thrusts: AI-assisted acquisition of multimodal data. This is really more on the imaging side, and looking at quantitative microstructure representations, or as we call it, QMR. And hopefully you hear about this more throughout the day today and tomorrow. And again, the novel physics-driven neural learning architectures to identify these key QMR features. So, let me focus on theme one, and these are some of the challenges that I see. So on the data acquisition side, we need to think about faster scans. So we'd like to use fewer projections. We should be able to track features automatically. This is where a lot of the AI comes in. On the reconstruction side, once we get the projections, we need to reconstruct, and typically it's a filtered back projection algorithm. But here, machine learning can really help us with denoising and other kinds of aspects of the reconstruction, particularly as we go into faster and faster experiments. And we're doing this in 4D. And finally, in the segmentation part, and I'll show you some examples, is using the deep learning approach for image segmentation and saving a lot of time in terms of doing a lot of this data analysis, which can be complicated both by time and can be biased by the human aspects of this. So, Yang, just let me know if I'm running over time. Okay, great, thank you. So let me show you just an example that we've done recently where I think some of these challenges will maybe come to the forefront. So we're looking at nanoporous materials. This is a collaboration with Bruno Azeredo, also at the Polytechnic School at ASU. You can use this for biosensors. We can use it for fuel cells and catalysis. And typically, what we're trying to do here is to create a nanoporous structure. And this is done by essentially a process called dealloying. So you think of this two-phase material, and you're going to etch it in a particular acidic solution. You get leaching and you get diffusion of the alloys. So in this particular case, it's a bimetallic alloy. And then you're left with the ligaments, and you get a very nice 3D porous structure. Okay, so here are examples of CuAl2. These are atomized powders. And when we actually do the dealloying, you can see that you get a very nice porous structure here. The aluminum precipitates are removed, and you're left with a copper scaffold, if you will. And so you have pores that range all the way from 5 to 200 nanometers. And so this has some very interesting implications because of the high surface area and the high surface energy associated with these materials. You can think of sort of cold welding or reduction in melting point during sintering. And so you can have actually very low temperature sinterability with these materials. Okay. So here's an example of actual neck formation. These are actually two different gas atomized powders. And once we heated them up, you actually see this necking. And so the idea was to look at this sintering process in 4D using the synchrotron facility and looking at tomography truly at the nanoscale. Okay, so we use a transmission X-ray microscope at the APS. This is typically, you can make a pillar or some other kind of very small diameter sample. This particular one was actually for aluminum. It's a solid material. It's not that porous structure that I showed, but just to give you an example of the resolution here. And so you come up with a lot of challenges, right? So during the scan, we'd love to have feature-based tracking. During the projection part, we'd like to have very fast acquisition rate. So we'd like to be able to reduce the noise. We'd be able to, with these very small samples, you also get motion issues. So we have to compensate for motion and drift and those kinds of things. Okay, so in this particular experiment, we heat up the sample. You have an inert gas outlet, and we put these microspheres in a glass cylinder that looks something like this. This is tomography that was done in the lab prior to going to the synchrotron. And you have these clumps of these powder particles, and then we do the sintering then in situ at the synchrotron. So the folks at the APS have developed some of these algorithms for alignment of the projections, and they're using things like optical flow, which is essentially looking at the pattern of the motion of objects, could be surfaces, could be edges. This is used a lot in this regular imaging. And so they've applied this to actually X-ray imaging. So you have your initial data here, you have some misalignment, and with the optical flow algorithms, you can actually then correct for a lot of this. Okay, so here's an example of, for our samples, filtered back projection on the left. So you can see a lot of the ring artifacts, and with the optical flow, we can get significant improvements by correcting for the specimen and drift that take place during the vibration or the heating. So, okay. And here I think you can see it more clearly. These are actually 3D reconstructions of a single copper particle. So on the bottom is the filtered back projection, and on the top is the optical flow. So we can actually get much better resolution, much better sharpness with the images. And of course, we can always try to do better and improve the quality here. And finally, so the image segmentation part, and so taking these grayscale images and transforming them into segmented images is key, because we can use this for rendering, we can use this for statistical quantification. And statistical quantification is extremely important when we think about the 4D aspect of these experiments, because we want to be able to quantify statistically the changes in the microstructure, whether it be coarsening, whether it be cracking, or something else. So we've done some initial experiments, and others in the team are working with this, working with Pejman as well at Wyoming, using some of his codes. Here's an example of taking TXM data and actually using convolutional neural network approach. And so here you actually use some manually segmented training data along with the grayscale images. And by doing that, you can actually then get fully reconstructed data sets in a matter of a day. And this is all sort of automated. Whereas an undergraduate student doing this manually could do only a 30th of the full data set, and it could take them several days or weeks, and it's all manual. So this is really a great tool that we have with machine learning and AI to be able to do this efficiently. Okay, so I'll just show you a couple of examples here where we used image segmentation, ground truth for nanoscale tomography, and different kinds of AI codes here, mainly based on CNN. And so use things like UNet and UNet++. In this particular case, you have these jump steps here in the UNet++ that give you actually much faster solution to the problem. And actually, I'll just skip through this, and you can see that the overall accuracy is fairly good for a lot of these models. But with things like the UNet++, you actually get much better agreement with the ground truth and also much lower training time. So, and one last thing I want to throw out there is, we talk about images for training of the models. And when we think about tomography data, and when we reslice this data, we need to also think about the differences in the images. And are we using the most contrasting images in terms of microstructural features? So here we did a very simple example where we took all the slices, we resliced the data set, and we started looking at slices that were 1 slice apart, 2 slices apart, 10 slices apart. And we realized that there is actually a nice threshold there where some of these slices are actually quite redundant because they're very closely spaced. So it's not just about blindly using these images as training data. We would like to inform the algorithms with as different images of the microstructures, just like you would if you were training a child or training a human being, that we want to get as wide a distribution of images to more efficiently do this. And so, so here's actually an example where we can get to a distance of, say, 10 slices or even 20 slices, so every 20th slice, and still get the same accuracy as we do as if we use every 2 slices. Okay, so so that was kind of an interesting thing that came out of this, in the sense that we can use less amount of training, less amount of number of images if we're smart about how we do the actual training process. And taking this again to a diffraction contrast tomography, we can use machine learning to train algorithms to actually be able to predict what these diffraction streaks should be. So we actually train these algorithms with very high quality data at, say, 0 hours. And then once we do the 4D experiment, once we train the algorithm, we can then start to reduce the exposure time and use the machine learning algorithm to then predict what the streaks will be. Okay, so you can then save the amount of time that it takes to do the experiment in the lab. So instead of going 10 to 30 hours per scan, you can go to a fraction of that. Okay, here's actually just an example of that with silicon cubes. So I will end there with just you know, sort of the holy grail, I would say, with 4D, and this is some work we're doing with folks at the Advanced Photon Source, is to do all of the things that I have described in my talk: reconstruction, feature tracking, image segmentation, all on the fly. And we're hoping to get this to reality through this AI Institute. We're hopefully be doing some experiments in November to try to actually try this out for the first time. We've developed the hardware and other things. But this will really revolutionize, I think, the way that we do and think about 4D. And of course, AI is a huge part of this, because we have to be able to do this in a very quick and efficient and accurate way. So I will end there. I hope I've given you a flavor of some of the important challenges associated with 3D and 4D microscopy. Talked a little bit about some of the advances that are being made with algorithm development and machine learning, optical flow, CNN-based algorithms. And I'd like to acknowledge several students and postdocs here at Purdue, our collaborators at the APS, and then, of course, collaborators as part of this project at ASU and also at the University of Wyoming. So with that, I will end, hopefully given a few minutes for questions. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Nick. This is a very, very inspiring talk. So we still have like 7 minutes for questions. So do we have any question from the audience?
Sure. So I'm Logan Ward from Argonne's Data Science Division. And I really like the notion of where it seems you're integrating these AI tools kind of directly into how you use CAPS. What do you see the advantages of being able to perform these analyses in real time? And I guess also, what do you mean by real time? Is that hours, minutes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of these phenomena that we're looking at are what I call truly dynamic events, and things that happen in many cases less than a second, maybe a few tens of seconds. At the lab scale, we are constrained by the time, the acquisition time that it takes to collect these data sets, primarily because we're using much lower fluxes and we're using a polychromatic beam. So it's not unusual to have scans that are hours on end. And so you can do things that are interrupted in nature, but we're really running up against the time constraints. And at the APS, because we have huge amounts of flux, and we have all of these very nice tools, we can actually start to capture these events in almost real time. I mean, with some of the foam experiments, we were actually capturing the data with continuous loading, and the acquisition was actually faster than the loading rate. So we could truly capture the projections without any real distortion in the images. With the corrosion experiments, with the sintering, for example, we built a little bit of, I would say, some backfill there in terms of the time. We were more on the minutes, time scale, but still fairly quick, and that too at the nanoscale. So with the recent developments, we're actually really excited to be able to track a feature automatically, do the image segment reconstruction and image segmentation, and all on the fly while the experiment is developing, while the microstructure is changing.
And is that kind of ability to see that reconstruction, say, help you decide like changes in imaging conditions, switching out different samples, or moving the area of interest?
Exactly. Okay. So in this particular case, I'm sorry, I kind of glossed over this. We have a tin bismuth alloy that's in the liquid state, and we're solidifying this. And the white particles are bismuth-rich particles. And we'd like to understand how these bismuth-rich particles are nucleating and growing as you go from the liquid to the solid state. Mm-hmm. And so, so we have some data here, and you can see that these bismuth particles actually form pyramidal geometry. And I don't think anybody has seen or understood why they form these very nice pyramidal shape. And so we're hoping that these real-time experiments will shed some light as to why this happens.
That's fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? We still probably have time for one more question. Okay, so if no question from the audience, I do have a question, Nick, for the corrosion stuff. We have been talking about this for a while. So you nicely show that at this stage, we can resolve a lot of structural features that possibly correlate with for example, the corrosion crack growth. Where do you think that would AI to help you in this in the next step? I understand that we have a lot of, you have a lot of nice tools to do this real-time image processing to get the nice data correlated together. But in terms of discovering, for example, like physical mechanisms, where do you see AI that could help? What are the challenges for now that, stop us seeing the real physics in the system?
Yeah, that's a great point, Yang. So I think one of the things is fusing this data. right? So we have the imaging data, we have the grain boundary orientation data, and frankly, so far, we have been sort of manually looking at this data and number one, trying to fuse it, and number one, trying to make some correlations about how precipitate structure and grain orientation come together to predict where cracks are initiating and why. And I think that if we can take the human component out of this, in addition to all of the image analysis, reconstruction, and things that I've talked about, that third thrust, which is to really teach the algorithm the physics, if we could ideally incorporate some knowledge into the algorithm about how grain misorientation and surface energies affect the susceptibility to corrosion, galvanic cell kind of information or data, then maybe you could actually even predict this for a range of material systems or even hypothetical material systems prior to doing the experiment. And then we can target the experiments a lot more surgically in terms of particular systems that are of interest.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very inspiring. So if we do not have any other questions, let's thank our speaker again for this very, very interesting, inspiring talk.